Now that we've gone over the process of transferring images into your computer, let's talk about file management. Now, what is file management and why is it important? Basically, file management is the process of organizing images in your computer. And the reason why it's important is because it not only makes it easier for you to be able to locate images when you need them, but it also simplifies your workflow and your backup. Now, when it comes to file management, we're going to talk about 3 different methods. The first one is manual file management, and that's when you're using your computer's operating system to be able to move the files, create folders, and organize your images. The second method is called automated file management, and that's when you use software like Lightroom to take advantage of its built-in capabilities in order to organize your images. And lastly, there's hybrid file management. This method is the combination of the first two, where you're using your operating system to create the initial folder structure, but then you use software to do the file management for you. Now, let me give you an example about why file management has been important for me and my workflow. When I started out in photography, I really didn't shoot much. So my images were stored in my computer in different places, and I really didn't care. There was no consistency in the way that I stored the images. But over time, what started happening is I started to shoot more and more. I realized that I'm keeping these images in different places, in different folders in the computer, and I really started having issues with basically locating images when I needed them. So the need for a more complex file management came up. And when that happened, I realized, well, how do I do this properly so that it becomes simple enough for me to follow it year after year without having to go through different steps and then finding the images. So I had to come up with my basic folder structure first. And when I did that, I realized that I actually can use my operating system to create that basic folder structure and then take software like Lightroom to do most of the file management for me. So today, since I shoot about 30 to 40,000 images per year, now I have a very consistent workflow in terms of storing images in my computer and the way I organize them, which really helps me in keeping myself organized year after year. And like I said before, it helps me to simplify the entire workflow process, including my backup processes. So let's go over these 3 methods in detail and discuss their pros and cons. First, we'll get started with manual file management. So what is it? Basically, just like I said before, in manual file management, you're going to use your operating system to move your folders and images after you transfer them to your computer. So we got a typical situation here. I've got a folder right here that has images. Then throughout my computer, I've got a D drive and an E drive. I've got images here in these 2 folders. Then I have more images here on the E drive. So a pretty big mess. And the whole idea of file management is to try to keep things organized. Whether I'm doing manually or using some other software, it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, the idea is to put everything in one place. Because if you do put everything in one place, it will simplify everything else. So let's talk about the first step, which is to create one main folder which will store all of these images in it. And I will explain why in a minute. So I'm going to call it photos, but you could call it pictures, images, whatever you'd like. And the idea here is to take all of these images from my desktop, from all these different folders, and put them all into one main folder. If I do that, then I don't have to worry about my images being scattered in different places. Now, people do this for different reasons. Sometimes you don't have enough storage, and that's the reason why it forces you to put some images maybe on your external drive, on your local drive, so on and so forth. But the best thing to do is to, again, have everything consistently stored in one place. So in my computer right here, I've got 3 hard drives. I've got a C drive where all of my operating system files reside. I don't really store much stuff in there, but I have 2 drives kind of dedicated for my use in photography. My D drive is a 256 gigabyte SSD drive. It's really fast, and I use it for Lightroom catalogs. And then my E drive is just a regular hard drive that I use specifically for storage needs. It's a 2 terabyte volume, as you can see here. And the idea here is to dedicate one drive that has massive amounts of storage just for photos. And that's exactly what I'm going to use it for. So that's why I created this photos folder in this drive. So here, let's use the manual file management tools, which is using the operating system. So once I created that photos, I can now start moving the folders in there. And let's go ahead and do that. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this one folder, Death Valley trip, from my desktop. Then I'm going to go ahead and go into my D drive, and I've got 2 other folders here that I need to copy. And then we've got one more, which is sitting on the main E drive, and that's the wedding photos that I was talking about earlier. So let's go ahead and copy those. So right now, everything is getting copied over to from all these different locations that I had into one main folder called Photos. And the idea here is, again, simplicity. Why should I have all these images in different locations when I could have one main folder called Photos where everything else resides? But as I do this, there is a potential problem, and the potential problem is organizing these images. So let's talk about that now. Now that everything has been copied over, I have a basic problem, which is that everything is stored alphabetically. And I know that these events and the images that I took in those events took place in different years and different months. So how do I get a better organization out of this basic folder structure? Well, what I can do is I can actually have the folder contain the year and the month. And if I do that, then it will be a little bit better organized. Also, I have another problem. All of these images right here, they are the way that they came from my camera, and they're all named DSC underscore some numbers, which really doesn't make any sense. And the basic problem that I'm gonna have is if I accidentally copy images from, say, my Death Valley trip into another folder, I won't know that that image should not belong in that other folder. So I also need a way to properly organize the images there so that I don't have those kind of problems. So the first step here is let's just see when exactly these images were taken so that I could append that to the folder name itself. So how do I do that? Now, my operating system has some capabilities and also has some limitations. So when I look at the date column, this is actually very inaccurate because 4/12/2016 is today. And if I rely on that date, that's not gonna work because I know for a fact that wedding was not taken today. So one way to look into an image and identify, to see if my operating system can actually look into its details, something called EXIF data, which is basically header information that stores all the information about the actual image, like the camera that the image was shot with, the date and time the image was captured. All of that information is stored in the images. However, my operating system does not have a way to read this particular image. So as you can see, all these fields are blank. If I look at another folder which maybe has images that my computer can read, then I can use the capabilities of my computer, or my operating system in this case, to be able to find that information. So in this case, the camera that I shot with was the Canon 6D, and my operating system can actually read this file, and that's why this information here, date taken, when it was actually captured, is accurate, and I know I can rely on that information. Now, what do you do if your operating system cannot properly identify information within your images? What you can do is you can use software, and I'm using a software called Fast Raw Viewer, which I personally utilize primarily for the culling process when I shoot images to go over and identify the ones that I want to keep or the ones that I want to delete. So in this case, I can use the software, and it has a built-in capability to read that EXIF information from the images. So here, as you can see, it clearly shows that the date and time that the image was captured was 2014-05-03. So if I go back to my previous folder that I was working with on the wedding, and if I double-click that image, it's actually going to give me that accurate information. So here, I know 2012 was the year and the month was 08. So that is enough information for me to actually properly rename this folder. So what I could do here, I could say it's 2012-08-Ashley and James wedding. So we can do the same for these all other folders. I'm gonna go into this folder, double click that image, and here we can see that this image was captured in 2016-01, so January 2016. I'm gonna go back, rename. And I'll do the same for these two. Now that it's done, we can see that we have a much better way to sort through the folders, because now I have the year, the month, and the name of the event that took place. This looks already much better than what I had before, because now I can say, okay, well, I can separate all the 2012 shoots, I know that this is 2014 and this is 2016. But I still have a problem, which is if I go into each one of these folders, I still have all these names that really don't make any sense. DSC underscore something something. So I don't want that. I actually want my images to be properly named in case I move these images from one place to another or something happens and I need to restore, that I don't have to worry about, well, where does that DSC belong or that DSC belong. So in this case, what I want to do is I actually want to use the same title of the event and maybe use the same naming structure, 2012-06, in my file name. So let's go ahead and try that. I'm going to go ahead and select all the images by pressing Control A. And then I'm going to go ahead and right click and say rename. And I could say, okay, well, I want to have 2012. I'm going to go ahead and delete that. -06 Emily and Brandon portraits. Now, if I do that, my operating system is smart enough to understand that I selected all these different images and that it needs to put a sequence number. And as you can see, it now has a proper sequence number in front of each file, starting from 1 all the way down to 35. And it has year, month, and the name of the event. However, there are cases where this can actually lead to messy results. And the cause of that in this particular case, as you will see, I'm going to go ahead and name this 2004 or 1405 London trip. And when I do that, check this out. Look at that. How did that happen that I've got 3 London trips named exactly the same? 111, then I've got 222, 333. This is really weird. That's not supposed to happen. And then down here, it goes back to normal. Well, the reason why this happened is because I actually shot with like 3 or 4 different cameras in that trip. And because of the different extensions of the files, my operating system completely messed up the naming structure. So this is actually not going to work for me because now I have one file named the same way as the second and the third file just because of the different extensions of the images. So this is not obviously going to work in this case, and I'm going to have to find a way to fix that. I'm going to go ahead and undo to go back to where it was because that's clearly not going to work. And that's kind of the limitation of my operating system. If I were to do this properly, I could sort it by extension, then try to name in groups, and it's just going to add a lot of headache. Or maybe I could use some external software to do the proper renaming for me. But just be aware of these operating system limitations. And if you're a Mac user, you might actually have to rely on a third-party tool to do the proper renaming for you. The basic idea here is that if I take this picture, for example, and if I move it somewhere or I copy it somewhere, for example, my desktop, just looking at the title of the image itself and the file name here, I know where it needs to belong. So if I accidentally put it here and now I wonder, well, where do I need to move it back to? I know that I actually took it from this folder called 2016-06 Emily and Brandon Portraits because that's contained in my file name. Makes sense. Let's go ahead and get rid of that. And I'm going to go back. So this is basically manual file management. What you're doing here is you're utilizing just the operating system itself to copy images. We created one simple folder structure called photos and everything went underneath. We named folders and prefixed them with a year, month, and then the name of the event. Now you might be wondering why I left images in their original location. For example, here I've got the Death Valley trip here, still on my desktop, Ashley and James wedding, and then I've got a bunch of images on my D drive. Well, I did it for 2 reasons. First, I wanted to make sure that I copy everything over and everything is there and I can verify that I did not have any problems during the copying process. And the second reason is I actually want to use the same messy structure for the second method. So let's go ahead and now discuss the automated file management using software like Lightroom. I'm a Lightroom user, so I'm going to demonstrate its capabilities with file management, but you can use other software to achieve similar results. So in Lightroom, I went ahead and created a brand new catalog. So this is the way that Lightroom is going to look when you just have it installed. As you can see, I really don't have anything in here. And what we're going to do is we're going to take all of these images from my desktop, from these folders, the E drive, the D drive. We're going to move all of that into our basic folder structure. So we're going to create a folder called photos, and I'm going to go ahead and create it on our file system level, okay? And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to move everything from all these different locations into this one master folder. And what I'm going to use Lightroom for is I'm going to use its built-in capabilities in order to organize my images. Let me show you how I do that. So I'll go to File, Import Photos and Video. And in this screen right here, when you start importing, you have a bunch of different options. On the top here, you can select the source first on the left side, where you're going to copy the images from. Then you have the option to either copy as DNG, copy, move, or add. And then on the right-hand side, it's showing you the destination location of where the images are going to be stored. Now, a lot of photographers will import images and simply click Add. When you do that, you're not copying any of the images over. What you're doing here is you're simply adding them to the Lightroom database. Now remember, Lightroom in itself is a database system. It has a catalog that stores all this information about how you edit images, and then it stores the symbolic links to where the images are physically located in your computer. So technically speaking, it doesn't contain the images itself. It's simply a reference to the images that you already have in the system. So if I do add, then I'm not going to copy anything over. That's, in this case, on the right-hand side, you can see I don't have a way to select my destination here. It just says my catalog. So if I click add, nothing gets moved. And that doesn't actually solve my problem with all the images being scattered everywhere. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to either select copy or move. I'm going to go ahead and move this time because A, I trust Lightroom to be able to do that for me, and B, I actually don't need them to be in original location. So I'm going to go ahead and move, and in here you can actually have a built-in capability to select multiple locations. So if I say I want to do Emily portraits and Emily and Brandon portraits here, London trip, and Ashley and James wedding, and I want to import all of those, if I click on the first folder, then hit Control and hold it, and then continue holding the Control button and just selecting multiple locations, as you can see, all of those images from all those different locations got selected. The only thing that I'm missing here is my desktop, so I'm going to go ahead and go into my desktop as well, expand that, and select Death Valley trip. So now I basically selected all of the images that I have in the different locations, and they're all ready to be imported. So let's talk about now this area right here, which is file handling, renaming, applying import, and then destination. So file handling is the first screen you see here, and I've got the option here to build previews. Now, what previews are, when you import images, in this case, I'm importing a lot of raw images. I don't have any JPEGs. So the software itself can build something called a preview. And this preview allows me to quickly navigate through the images without having to wait for the computer to read through the images and then create those previews for me. So what I could do is I could create a minimal one, which is basically going to be a very small preview of the image. Then I can do embedded in sidecar, standard, and one-to-one. Now I typically choose minimal because I don't want my computer to go through the process of rendering each file. But if you have a lot of high resolution images and if you want to click on the image and get to its pixel level view, which is viewing the image at 100% view without having to wait for it to render, you can select one-to-one. I'm going to go ahead and select minimal for now. Another cool advantage of Lightroom is that you can actually create something called a smart preview. Now, if you're a photographer and you travel on the road and you have a lot of images, you want to be able to edit them on your laptop, but your laptop doesn't have enough storage, you could create a smart preview as you import the images. And what that will do is it will actually create a small raw file, like a DNG image, of the original, and it's going to be much smaller resolution, but you can still do all of the normal editing that you do in Lightroom. That's a really cool feature. I really don't need it for now, so I'm not going to select that. The third option is the ability to skip duplicates, and that's probably one of the most important reasons why I and many others use Lightroom is that if you do this properly, you're not going to have a problem with duplicating images in your computer. So I have this checked by default. And the way this works is that when Lightroom starts reading the images, while my operating system cannot have the capability to go through each image and identify when the image was captured, Lightroom does have this capability. So it reads all this EXIF information from images and compiles it. So if I have an image that I captured and it has a particular year, month, date, and time, if I try to import another image with exactly the same information and all this other EXIF information is going to be identical, then Lightroom is going to know that I already have it in the catalog and is going to prevent me from importing it, which is really nice. So I have that checked by default. Make a second copy too. That's basically to create a backup on import. I don't do that. And add to collection is something that we'll talk about later when you create collections, but you can do this on the fly as you import as well, which is neat. And that's a way to organize images, by the way. So the next thing here, and I'm not going to select any of these for now, file renaming. And now this is a real power of Lightroom, because what you can do as the images get imported, as I said before, all of these images have these weird names, DSC underscore something something. What I can do is I can actually click here and I can say, you know what, I want this to have a particular naming structure. So what I can do is I can say, you know what, make it custom name and a sequence. And if I do that, I can actually type the name of the event, for example, Death Valley Trip. And if I do that, it allows me to select the sequence number. So I can say it's going to be number 1. And as you can see on the sample here, it says Death Valley Trip -1.raw. Now, this is really nice because as I import images, I can actually properly rename them without having this DSC underscore business. Now, what I'm going to do is I am going to actually show you later how you can use the power of this file renaming tool to create your own template as you import images so that you can properly rename the images. For now, I'm just going to import them the way they are because I have a bunch of images that I selected, and if I have one renaming file structure, then as it imports, everything is going to become that name. So I don't want that for now. So I'm going to skip that for now. And then apply during import is another really cool feature because it allows you to select a particular preset. If you create your own preset in the develop module of Lightroom, for example, particular settings like sharpening, you can apply those corrections during the import. And metadata is another really cool trick, which we'll talk about later in our Lightroom introduction, where you can actually apply your copyright information and other metadata to each image as it gets imported. And you also have the capability to do keywords, which I'm not going to add at this time. We'll discuss this later. So the main thing that I come to now is destination. And here, I need to now select exactly where my images are going to be placed. And as you remember, I actually created a photos folder. So I'm going to go ahead and navigate to that drive, which is my E drive that stores that photos folder. Remember, parent structure with one folder for simplification reasons. So here, I'm going to go ahead and select it. And I've got a bunch of options here. I can actually organize images, and I could say, you know what, I want to organize images by original folders. And as you can see, it's simply going to copy everything from the left side to the right side and retain the original folder structure name. Or I could say organize everything by date. And if I do that, it allows me to select between all these different date formats. So if I said I want to retain that initial one where I was using a year and a month, I could say 2016-04, and it will create the parent folder year, and underneath it will create months, and then underneath it will place all those images. Well, I really don't like this, to be honest, and although there's a way for me to even pick something like a year, a month, and even a day if you want to separate things by day, I don't like this option because I don't want to have all these many subfolders. It just complicates things for me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do into one folder, which allows me to put everything into this one photos folder for now. And I'm going to just import everything that I've got from the left side to this one main folder because I'm going to use Lightroom's capabilities to manage my files. So let's go ahead and do that. And I'm going to again select move here from the top, and everything is sorted by capture time. Go ahead and click import. And right now, what my computer is doing and Lightroom is doing is it's actually physically moving images from their original locations. If I minimize this, as you can see, my photos folder is now getting many more images here. And my folders that I originally had, they're eventually going to get emptied out. So as it's transferring the images, I can look at the progress. I can just scroll down here, and right now it's doing the Ashley and James wedding. And eventually it's going to get to my Death Valley trip. And when it does happen, you will see that all of these images will disappear from their original location. And it's happening right now. All right, so everything got moved over. And if I look at my original file system, that folder is empty. Well, didn't delete the folders, unfortunately, for me. But as you can see, all the images are now in my photos folder. And they still have that DSC underscore something something as the original file name. And the problem here is that if I had any names that were clashing, I could potentially run into an issue just because I could have two DSC underscore 1020s. But Lightroom would warn that, and I would be able to rename the images anyway, so shouldn't be a big of a problem for now. I'm going to go ahead and delete these original folder names because I actually don't need them. So I'm going to go back and delete these two folders. Everything got imported. Now, everything got deleted, and I've got one photos folder where everything is stored. How do we now utilize Lightroom to properly organize my images? So here you see the folders on the left side, and this folders is actually an accurate representation of the images that I have on my file system. So if I go back to the E drive, I've got photos here, photos here. If I double click here, I have 321 items here, 321 items here. So I know that in my file system level, this photos folder and this photos folder here in Lightroom are exactly the same. Now, I'm going to go ahead and minimize this. We're not going to worry about any of the features here in the folders. We'll talk about that in hybrid file management. Here, I want to use the power of Lightroom's built-in capabilities for organizing my images. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create different collections. So the nice thing about the collection is that you can create a collection which basically references specific images. And I can create a collection set, which is basically a folder. And then I can create a collection which can be a subfolder. And I'll show you how this works in a second. So I'm going to go ahead and create a collection set because I want to identify like weddings from portraits, for example. So what I could do is I could call a collection set weddings. And I have only one wedding that I need to throw in there. As you can see, it looks like a folder. So I need to now find the images from Ashley and James. And this kind of becomes a little bit cumbersome because I literally have to scroll through all these images that I imported. This is the last image from that set. And then find the first image, which is going to be this one. If I hold the Shift key and click on the first image, it allows me to select this group of images. So now what I could do is I could click here and I could say create a collection. And as you can see, I have the option here, include selected photos. And I could call it now Ashley and James wedding. So now I have the option to select inside a collection set, which is exactly what I want to do. I'm just going to select weddings. What this will do when I click create, it just created this collection called Ashley and James wedding, and it's under weddings. Now, if I organize another one, and I'll just create a collection set, and I'll call it trips, and I do not need that checked. This collection set is going to contain my images from London. So now I have to go back into my photos and select images from London. So right here is the first photo, and this is the last one. And I'm going to do exactly the same thing through here, or I could actually right-click the trips here and create a collection, which will by default now have this inside a collection set checked. So I'll just call it London trip. And I'm going to go ahead and create that. As you can see now, I've got a London trip. So now I know I have another trip to add, so I can just create a collection, call it Death Valley Trip, and I'm just going to create it under the set trips, create. Now what I can do is I can go back to my photos folder, come down and select all the images from Death Valley, and I can simply drag them to this Death Valley Trip collection. Now, as you can see, I already have some basic structure going on here under collections. I've got a trips. If I click on that, it shows me all the trips that I had. And if I click on a separate collection underneath, like the Death Valley trip or the London trip, it allows me to only look at the images that are relevant and are inside that collection. That's a really powerful feature and something that you can do. Now, another way to do it is if you say, well, I don't know if I want to use a collection. Some people actually heavily utilize keywords. I personally don't really use them as much, but they can be pretty powerful. So what I could do, I could say, I'm going to go ahead and select all the images from London, and I could go back to photos, or since I already have a collection, I'm just going to select them all by pressing Control A or Command A in Mac. And right here where I have the keyword tags within the library window, I could say, this is called London trip. And if I press enter, now all of these images that I selected just got tagged with London trip. I could do the same with Death Valley trip and just type in Death Valley trip. And now all the images here got tagged with that Death Valley. Now, if I go back to photos and I say, well, let's say I don't have collections, but I want to utilize the keywords. What I could do is I could actually scroll down here and then select the keyword that I need. And there's an arrow right here. If I click on that arrow, it allows me to basically filter the images that have that keyword London trip. And as you can see, Lightroom actually used the metadata filter right here, and we'll talk about it later, but this is really powerful. And then it actually allowed to find all the images that have been tagged with the words London trip. And this is all the images that belong to that set. And I can actually navigate through the different ones, like these ones I created earlier. I could click on the Death Valley or Emily and Brandon or the Ashley and James wedding. And as you can see, this allows me to go into these specific images based on the keywords. Now, the important thing to realize here is that I'm actually not doing anything to the images on the file system level. And right here, if I go to this photos folder, as you can see, nothing has changed. The original file names are all the same. Nothing got added to the images. The only thing that I've got here is collections and keywords to rely on. Now, that is the biggest problem with using software like Lightroom to use its specific tools within the software to organize images, because I'm heavily relying on these collections and these keywords. Now, what happens if I lose Lightroom? Or maybe I lose the catalog completely. What if you lose all your backups? In that case, there's no way for me to retrieve that information back, because what I'm left with is this basic file structure that I created before, which is just one folder and all the images underneath. And really, for me, this doesn't do anything. So I personally try not to use this method. While it does work for many photographers out there, my personal preference is to have the flexibility to organize images on the file system level and use my software's built-in capabilities to read the EXIF information to help me properly name images. And that is the next step we're going to talk about shortly. But you might say, well, you know what? I can actually select images from here and name them. Yes, there is a capability. Remember, when I was importing images, I could actually rename the images. So let's just try that real quick. The nice thing about Lightroom is that it does have this capability built in. So although I'm storing images all in that photos folder and they're all DSC underscore something something, I could go into library here and then say, I'm going to rename and Emily and Brandon portraits. So if I do this, I can actually select something like custom name and sequence, Emily and Brandon portraits, number 1. And then if I click OK, what this just did, it physically renamed images in the file system. If I go back to my photos folder and if I scroll down, look at that. We now have images with the names that I picked. So now I have Emily and Brandon portraits, and I could go ahead and rename all the others. So what it's doing, it's now using Lightroom's capability to physically rename images in your computer. And you could do that during import, or you could do that later on. Now, this is something we're going to discuss in detail in hybrid file management. So now let's jump over to the last section, or the last method that I personally rely on to utilize the power of Lightroom to organize images. Like I said before, hybrid file management is when you combine the power of manual file management when you're using your operating system to create the initial folder structure with the file management capabilities of software like Lightroom. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to find a way to organize all of these images in Lightroom so that my folder structure reflects that organization. So the way I'm going to do it is I personally don't rely on collections at all. So I'm going to go ahead and actually just get rid of them because I don't use them. So we're going to go ahead and delete trips and weddings. And I'm not going to care about the keywords. You know, they really don't harm me. So in this case, what I want to do is I want to create a folder structure under photos where everything is organized by year first and event second. And I'll explain why in a minute. So what we're going to do is now we need to use all of these images have been already imported into Lightroom. And while import was taking place, Lightroom's built-in capability to read the EXIF data already populated the database with all the necessary information, including when the image was captured, what time and date, what type of camera and lens were used, and focal length, aperture. All that information is already stored in the database, which means that I can actually now click on the metadata filter tool here, and it's called the library filter. And I could say, you know what? I want to find all the images with particular dates. So what I could do here, if I click on this top field and select date, it allows me to actually filter through different years, and then I can navigate through even different months if I need to. This is really powerful because now I can quickly identify images without having to go through and selecting them. So for example, in 2012, I had images from June and August. If I click on June, look at that. We've got all those images from that day when these portraits were taken. And as you can see, it was taken on June 4th. I could even drill down to an individual day. And in August, if I click on August, one day was that wedding. Look at that. All the images are already pre-selected. So what I can do here now is I'm going to say, you know what? I now need to create the necessary folders. And I want to follow this same structure with the year. I've got 3 years to populate, 2012, 14, and 16. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to say create a folder inside photos, and this is going to be 2012. I'm not going to check any of these. Go ahead and create that. And then if I now select, see, 2012, it's grayed out because there's nothing in there. All the images are still stored in that parent folder. Now, check this out. If I go and look at this photos folder, now I have a 2012 underneath, but all the images are still messy underneath. So let's go ahead and create the others. So I'm going to go ahead and create folders, 2014, and create folder 2016. So now I have 3 years in here. Now, I know I want to separate these out by event, so I'm going to go ahead and click on that, select all of these images from Emily and Brandon, and I need to place them in this 2012 folder. So what I could do is I could create a folder underneath here and then drag and drop those photos in there. Or I could select those images again by going to metadata. June is already selected. All those images like that. And then I could say right click, create folder inside 2012. And I'm going to name it Emily and Brandon portraits. And if I click include selected photos, what it just did is Lightroom just physically moved all the images of Emily and Brandon into a folder that I just created under 2012. So we still have images from the wedding, and here we're going to go ahead and select all of these images, again, Control A or Command A, and same thing, create a folder, and this one is Ashley and James wedding. Again, I'm going to select the photos in there, and look at that. It's moving the images. And how we can tell is if we look, there's only 285, and now there's only 201 images left. So everything else, look at that. It's actually physically creating these on the file system level and moving them there. This is really neat. So let's do the rest. I've got one shoot in 2014, and I know that one was in May. And actually, that one spanned many days because I was in London for many days. So I'm going to go ahead and select May, select all these images and create a subfolder here. And that one is London trip. Again, including all the images. And it's moving. And lastly, I've got 2016. For this one, I'm just going to use a different method. I'm going to create a folder first. And we're going to call it Death Valley trip. And I'm not going to select any images. And then I'm going to use the drag and drop method that I talked about before. So select all the images and simply click that. And it says moving file on disk. This will cause the corresponding files on disk to be moved, which is fine. I'm going to go ahead and click move. Now, as you can see, it just created that file structure and folder structure for me. If I go back, look at that. My photos folder is now empty. There's not a single image in here. However, I've got folders in here. 2012 with 2 folders, subfolders, 2014 with 1, and 2016 with 1. Why is this good? The reason why is because when we initially did this, remember in the manual file management, we were actually using the date, year, and month as part of the folder name. Now, the reason why I personally prefer to separate years first, so underneath, if I go back to my root folder, I've got photos, that's my main folder. Underneath, I've got everything separated by year. Now, the reason why I do that, when I started out, it was not a problem, but over time it became a problem when I was just putting all the folders in one main subfolder, because what happened was I would run out of storage. And when that happened, I realized, well, also my Lightroom was getting slower because I was shooting 20, 30, 40,000 images in a year. So my Lightroom catalog started filling up really fast and it became really slow. And then I had all those images from many years. So I decided, well, if I make it a little bit more simplified by creating a year structure first underneath photos, then I could actually isolate things by year, because the chance of me going back to 2012 and editing images is very low. So I only typically care about the current year, 2016. So if I'm currently editing images, I only care about this last folder. These 2 folders can actually move from my primary storage in my computer, from that E drive, to maybe some backup storage, where maybe it's a hard drive or some other storage where I can just dump those images there. And if I need to work on them, I can always copy them back. So in this case, that is the primary reason why I recommend it. Also, when I create a Lightroom catalog, I actually name it by year. And I'll show you in a second how that looks as far as my personal structure. But it makes it easier if I have a year, so all the images for that year stored in that 1 year folder, and my Lightroom catalog is synced with that year. So in this case, I've got all of the stuff organized. Now let's talk about the second piece, which is we still have those images in their original DSC underscore something something. Now, earlier we actually did rename some images, and I believe it was from Emily and Brandon here, and as you can see, we have that. But the idea here is to combine the power of Lightroom to manage the files for me while the images still make sense at the operating system level. So what I want to do is I actually want to replicate, and I still want to incorporate some of the information that is stored within these images into the file names themselves. So let's go ahead and select Emily and Brandon, because that we renamed that before, and I can either press F2 on my keyboard, or I can go to Library, Rename Photos, and what we'll do is we'll create a new template for renaming files. And this is really powerful because if I click on Edit, I could actually select different things. So for example, if I select Custom Name - Sequence, as you remember, I can type in the name Emily and Brandon Portraits, and it allows me to put the sequence number in there. Instead, what I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and delete all of that. Is I first want to insert the date and time information for each image. So I want the date in this form, YYYYMMDD, which is basically I'm going to put the year first, then month, then day. Then I could put a dash, and then I could say, now I want to actually add custom text, which is going to be Emily and Brandon Portraits. And after that, you have to give a unique name to each file. So in this case, I want to create a sequence number. Now you have a bunch of different options here. I personally give sequence number with 0001. And the reason why is because the chance of me having a sequence number higher than 9,999, which means I would have to shoot more than 10,000 images, is very low for that particular, for any event in fact. So typically that will work for me pretty well, and then I need to add a dash in between. So now, as you can see, I've got year, month, day, dash, name of the event, Emily and Brandon portraits here, dash, sequence number, 0001, dot, extension. So this is how the images are going to be named. I'm going to go ahead and save this as a new preset, and I'm going to name it PL Video, but you can call it anything you want, really. Okay, so now I have this preset PL Video, and I'm going to click Done, and it's selected, and you can create as many presets as you want. But here, it has the capability, so I still have the capability to type in the custom text, and then this start number is the beginning sequence number. So if I do a different sequence number, that's the first name is going to be called 500.dng. So that's just something to keep in mind. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. So what it's doing right now, it's physically renaming this group of images that I selected in my file system. So if I go back, as you can see, 2012-06-04 dash Emily and Brandon portraits, and sequence number 1 is the first one, and the last image 34 is here. So this works really well, and the reason why it does for me, because if I end up, for example, accidentally moving this to my desktop and that image is now gone from here, this file name itself, since it makes sense and it contains the year, it contains all the information in it, including the event name, just by looking at the name itself, I know that it has to belong to my 2012 folder. And since I sort everything here underneath by event name, I know that this file name contains that Emily and Brandon portraits, so all I have to do is simply move it back. So that's it. And another good thing is that I can now use my operating system to search for a particular image, because my images now have 2 search criteria that I could use. I could use the year, month, and day, and I could use the name of the event. So let's go ahead and do that for London. Remember, in London, we had issues on the operating system level where it was creating duplicate file names when I was trying to use the manual method. So here, I'm going to go ahead and select all these images, hit F2, which again, you could access through library, and I'm going to use the same preset. As you can see, it's now pre-selected, and I'm going to call it London Trip. Now, sequence number is still the same. I'm going to click OK. Now, let's take a look at what happened here. If I go to 2014 London Trip, look at that. I no longer have that problem that I had on my operating system level, where just because I had the same extension, it was doing this weird file naming structure. Now everything is the way that it's supposed to be. No matter what camera I shot, it actually properly named all of them. And the proper naming is done because I have images sorted properly. So in this case, if I go to View, Sort, I can see that by default, the images are sorted by capture time, which means that the very first image that I selected is the first image that I took during that trip. And the last image here is the very last image before I left London. So this is really cool because now, remember, before I couldn't even use the day, and I only relied on year and month because I couldn't give the same day for all the images since they span multiple days. But look at what happened here on the file system level. I've got these images are taken on 0502, then on several images on 3 next day, 4, 5. So this is actually now utilizing the information that Lightroom read from each individual image in that EXIF tag information, and it's applying that information into the naming structure of the files. This is really powerful. This is something you cannot do on using the manual method because the operating system does not have that capability to create the database based on that information. Now, I'm not going to go ahead and rename all the images that I already have, like all these ones that I didn't do yet, but it's a good idea for you if you're just getting started with proper organization to go ahead and do that with all the images that you have in the file system. Because at the end of the day, what you want to have is you want to have the proper folder structure that makes sense. In this case, we've got one parent folder, photos, then we have photos organized by year, then within each year, we have photos organized by events. Now before, if you remember when I was creating a set, in the collections, I created one called weddings and I grouped weddings underneath. Then I did the same set for portraits or travel, and you could do something similar here too. So if you wanted to organize, say, the different events, and if I had multiple weddings and trips, and if I wanted to organize them differently, then I could create another subfolder structure, and instead of having just the event name here, I could have another folder called weddings and engagements, for example, and then I put all the weddings and engagements underneath that folder. So you can actually create the different layers of organization here, but the main thing is to keep this part where it shows all the folders completely in sync with your file system level. Because for me, at this point, if I say, you know what, I want to get rid of Lightroom and I don't want to use the software anymore and I want to move to another type of software, I don't have to worry about all these things that I did within Lightroom that I now depend on. Everything is 100% synced, and Lightroom is managing files for me the same way that I would manage them at the operating system level, except now I have all those powers of doing the filtering and reading the EXIF information. So keep this in mind. Now, another thing is, sometimes things go out of whack. For example, if I say, you know what, I want to work on 2016, 2014, but I don't necessarily care about 2012 anymore, so I'm gonna move this to a different drive. So I'm gonna go ahead and physically move that entire 2012 folder into a different drive. Now what happened here is I did something that I normally should not do, which is I physically moved images on my file system without letting Lightroom know that it actually took place. If I click on that, look at that. I now have an exclamation mark in front of all these images, and this entire folder is now with a question mark. And the reason why is because Lightroom just realized that the folder is missing at the operating system level. So when something like this happens, this is obviously a problem. Now, there are two ways that I could resolve this. I could say, well, I want to keep this and I want to keep all these edits in Lightroom. I could right-click this folder and say, find missing folder, and then go to the D drive where I actually moved the folder to, select that and select the folder. If I do that, there is a problem though. It's going to now point into a different place. So it's going to mess up the structure that I originally intended this to have. And maybe that's, in this case, it's not a good idea, but if you end up doing this and you see these question marks, you know that something is missing in the file system. I'm gonna go ahead and put this back to the E drive, and I'll show you one method to actually be able to synchronize everything that you've got in Lightroom with your operating system. So in this case, let's do an experiment. What I'll do is I'll take this one image right here, Emily and Brandon portrait, and I'm going to go ahead and move it in the file system level, okay? So 2012, and this is the first image right here. So I'm actually going to go ahead and move it to my desktop as if the image is missing. Now remember what's gonna happen. Lightroom knows right away that the image is not there, so it's warning me, photo is missing, you need to locate it. I'm not gonna worry about that. And then another thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go ahead and place an image into here, which I didn't have before. And I'll explain why I'm doing this in a second. So let's go ahead and grab a random image and place it in that folder. So what I'm doing now is I'm actually adding a file into this folder on my computer without letting Lightroom know that it took place. So Lightroom still thinks there's 321 images. This one is missing, and it doesn't know that the new image got added. So at the end of each year, what I typically like doing is I like resynchronizing all the information that I've got here in the folders in Lightroom with my operating system. So what I could do is right-click the parent folder photos, and I could say synchronize folder. And as you can see, Lightroom immediately identifies that there is a new photo to be imported. There's one, and now there is a remove missing photos from the catalog one. So it knows that one image is missing, and it knows that one image needs to be added. So I can uncheck that if I do not want that image removed, and I could say, let's go ahead and import, and I could click on show missing photos. That's the missing photo that we have. Or I could say, I'm gonna go ahead and synchronize the folder again, and this time I just want to synchronize, and I'm going to show the import dialog before importing because I wanna see what's missing. If I don't check this, it's just going to add the image into that one folder, Emily and Brandon portraits, where I dragged and dropped that image. So if I click on synchronize now, this is the image that it's about to import. And as you can see, by default, it's add. I cannot move or copy because the file is already there. All it's doing is adding into my Lightroom catalog. If I click on import now, the image is there. So let's go back to Emily and Brandon. We still have that missing photo in there, right there. And the image that I imported, this is on my son, is now in that folder. So now everything is in sync except we're missing that one photo. So I can either place that photo back or I can delete that photo from the catalog in order to fully keep everything in sync. So now I just moved manually the file back in here. So the file is there. And if I click this again, same thing, synchronize, nothing. So now if you see this and everything is grayed out, it means that Lightroom is 100% in sync with all the contents of the folder that is in here. So this is something that you need to keep in mind, is make sure that whatever you do in Lightroom, you actually want to delete images and move images or copy them. Everything, all those file operations should preferably take place within Lightroom and not at the operating system level. And if you do move things in the operating system level, be aware that Lightroom will show you those errors saying that things are missing and things like that. Now, the nice thing about Lightroom is that, remember, we created that renaming preset earlier called PL Video. And if I go to now File and Import Photos and Video, well, before I had everything kind of dumped into one folder and then I had to organize things from there using the information and the filtering capabilities of Lightroom. But now, going forward, since everything is now organized properly, what I could do is I could utilize that same renaming preset that I created. Under here in the import tool, we've got file renaming. I can check rename files, and I could say I'm going to use PL Video. And during the import process, if I had a memory card right now, if I inserted it and I had a bunch of images that I wanted to import, all I had to do is type in the custom text. So for example, if I went to California and had a California trip, all I have to do is type in that name here and then the sequence number. And when Lightroom imports all of those images, it's going to automatically name the files. That way, I do not have to do this after the import process. Another thing is, remember before, we moved everything into one folder. Now that I have everything organized by year, if say this California trip occurred in 2016, I could now click on 2016 and organize everything into one folder still the same way, and now I call it California trip. Now, if I do this and if I click import, when Lightroom imports everything, it's going to import all the images into a folder called California trip under 2016, and it's going to properly name each file. So this is going to, now going forward, automate the process for me every time when I import, as long as I provide the custom text for the file, which is the event here, California trip, and then I give the subfolder name and select that year where it needs to belong. When I click import, it's going to do all of that work for me. So that's another added benefit, is that you do not have to do all the stuff after you import. You can actually now use those presets and apply them during import, which simplifies your process of importing images so much more and simplifies this file management piece that I was talking about. Now, let's go ahead and summarize everything that we've talked about so far. So the first method we discussed was manual file management. We talked about its pros and cons and the ability of the file system to be able to read or not able to read files, and then you can create a basic folder structure again. We create photos folder, we put everything underneath, and then whether you organize and prefix folders by year or month, it's totally up to you. Still, the main problem with manual file management is that you're doing literally everything manually. So if you make a mistake, that's a huge problem. The second method we talked about was automated file management, and for that we use the built-in capabilities of Lightroom to create different collections or maybe use keywords to be able to organize our images. And the biggest problem with that method, while it does work for many photographers out there, the biggest problem is that you're so dependent on Lightroom and you're creating all this work within Lightroom that if one day you decide to move away from that platform and use something different, or perhaps your Lightroom catalog gets corrupted, now you have to start over. So to prevent that, the third method, which is the hybrid file management, for me personally at least, works the best, because what I do is I create the initial folder structure. I have photos folder and then organize everything by year, and then everything underneath is another subfolder by event name. And then what I do is I make sure that I actually use all the move and other operations within Lightroom itself and not at the operating system level to manage my images. So that's really important for me, because if I do everything right using the hybrid method, then, and as long as everything is properly in sync, and I showed you how to keep everything in sync, then going forward, it simplifies everything for me. Because if I do lose Lightroom or I move away from Lightroom to another system, not a problem. Everything is properly done. Everything's properly organized already. I can quickly locate images when I need them, and I do not need to rely on specific software to do that for me. So does this mean that the hybrid file management that I just showed you is the ultimate way to organize your images? Not necessarily, because there are other methods that work equally well. John, for example, uses a slightly different modification of the hybrid file management, and he will talk about why it works for him and some of the advantages and disadvantages of his approach. We just created a sample catalog in Lightroom, imported images, and performed all kinds of file operations within Lightroom. But let me show you how the actual Lightroom catalogs in my system look like and how I personally store images. So here, as I mentioned, I've got 3 drives. So my operating system is residing in this first drive, C. Then D, I named Speed because it's an SSD drive, and the primary reason for existence of this drive is my Lightroom catalog. And I've got one parent folder called Lightroom, within which everything is organized by year. So everything that I shot before 2008 is in one catalog called up to 2008, because I didn't have that many photos in there, and then everything else is organized there. And if I click on 2016, for example, this is the actual Lightroom catalog file, and then these are the previews that Lightroom generates, and it stores in a separate folder. Let's take a look now at the actual photos. So I typically use this E drive to store my current year. But for this exercise, I actually removed my 2016 folder because I didn't want to have 2 photos folder to work with. So I have everything on my network drive, and as you can see, this photos folder is my network volume storage array that contains every single year. This is where I typically keep all of my photos. All the raw images are stored here. So 2016 is right here. And if I went in there, I've got all these different subfolders that are organized. So if I go back and look at these individual years, these are all events, and then underneath each event, I've got images. So if I click on that, these are the images that belong to that event. And as you can see, the file structure is similar to what I discussed before: year, month, day, then event name, then sequence number, and everything is organized this way in my file system. So let's now compare my Lightroom catalog to this year, and you'll see that it actually matches up. I'm going to fire up Lightroom and open up my 2015 catalog. And it's on my D drive, Lightroom 2015. And if I open this up, you'll see that once I move it off my computer, I actually remap it to my storage device. So right now, it's actually accessing these 32,000 images from my network storage. And as you can see, I even have subfolders that have other events organized underneath. If I go to my photos folder, you can see I've got everything exactly the same. So if I click on Jordan trip, for example, all of these are matching my actual folders. So this is really important. As you organize going forward, you need to create a system. And this system works for me really well. I no longer have massive numbers of images stored in my Lightroom, and whenever I start a new year, I start a new year in my file system. So I'll have 2016 for this year. Next year I'm going to have another 2017, and then for each year I'm going to have a brand new catalog. So as you can see here, it doesn't even see the parent folder because it doesn't go beyond 2015.
Nasim just talked to you about his particular way of using hybrid file management, and I'm going to do the same thing and let you know how I use hybrid file management for my needs. Now, I'm a wedding photographer, so I do things just a little bit differently than he does, and I'll point out those differences in just a little bit here. But first, The main difference is going to be my overall file structure and how I use it. So I lean a little more heavily on the manual side of things. I create my file structure before importing photos. I don't rely on Lightroom to do that side of things. I use Lightroom for other reasons. So let's start with my file structure. You can see I have everything sorted by year, just like Nasim. So right here, this is a sample file structure. I don't actually have my hard drives with me that I can work off of, so I can't show you exactly how my particular drives are laid out. But this should give you a pretty good idea of how my file structure works. You can see again 2016, so that's the current year. And then I always have some default folders in here. So I have, right now there's new event, I have new headshot, and I have new wedding. And those are the three main types of photo shoots that I have. I mean, I can always go make another folder if I need to, but those are the three that I use the most and that I typically want these subfolders for. So let me talk about these subfolders. If I have a new wedding and I book this new wedding, let's go ahead and say it's going to be in September of this year. What I'll do is I will go ahead and create a duplicate copy of that folder. And let's say the wedding is September 1st. So I'll do 2016 0901, and let's just say it's between Nasim and Lola. So once I do that, I already have a whole folder in here for engagement session, have a whole folder in here for their wedding, and I don't have to go and redo all these folders. I don't have to recreate them every single time. They're already there for me. And they're basically just folders that I found myself creating over and over and over again. So I have a design folder for any album design that I have to put together. There's JPEG, which I'll talk about in a little bit here. Orders and notes. I already have a blank text file that I could type notes into. There's the print, so any prints that they order or that I print for them. And if I do any proofs. And then there's the raw folder. And that's where I put all of my raw images when I import them. So this is all set up for me before I ever even take a single photo. As soon as I book the wedding, I create this. If it's an event or something, I go ahead and just make the duplicate copy when I get back from the event. So I could do the exact same thing here. Maybe it's an awards banquet, and I have the similar folders in here if I need them. So that makes my life a lot easier. It's part of my workflow that I found I was doing over and over and over again, and I wanted to simplify it. So basically, all I have to do is copy the folder, rename it, and everything is there for me. When I import photos, I do that manually as well. I don't use Lightroom or any other software to get the photos off of my memory card and onto my storage. I'm actually plugging the card into my computer. I'm dragging the raw files from the memory card and I'm putting them into the appropriate folder on my drive. So in this case, every single folder that I create for every event or every photo shoot that I have has a raw folder already. That's where the images go as soon as they come off of the memory card. Now it's time to import them into Lightroom, and I've already covered that, so I don't need to go into detail about how that's done, but I will point out that I have my images exactly where I want them on my drive, so I don't want to move them anywhere else. So when I'm in the import dialog in Lightroom, I just go to add, and that adds them to Lightroom into my catalog in my database without moving anything on my hard drive. So let's talk about Lightroom now. Now in Lightroom, I don't use a lot of the features that Nasim uses. I don't use it for my file management. I already have that all set up. I use it mainly for editing, but I also use it for organizing photos, and I'll show you exactly how I do that here. So in Lightroom, I use collections a lot. I use collection sets, I use collections, and then even inside of those collections, I have all these sub-collections basically. So as an example, let's just take a look at my basic structure here. So I have all of my different types of shoots that I have and a lot of weddings in here. So let's just go ahead and look at weddings. Within weddings, I have each individual wedding, and you'll see my naming structure. I have the year, month, date, the couple's name. If I drag this over just a little bit, Rebecca and Ross. And then under each wedding, I have subfolders or sub-collections that are specific to each wedding. And in here I have the images that I put on my blog, for example. So these are all images that I edited, put on my blog, and I wanted to create a separate collection for those. I have all of the images from their wedding day in an order. So the order that they come out of the camera isn't always the order that I deliver them to the clients. So the ordered collection here is the actual order that I deliver to the clients in the way that tells the story the best, in the way that makes the most sense. I also have the photos collection, and basically what that is, that's every photo that came out of my camera and my second shooter's camera. So that's everything dumped in here. It's more or less the same as the raw images, but it's my Lightroom collection for all the photos from their particular wedding day. I also have a few others here. I don't need to go into detail, but you basically see how I have it organized. If I was to use Nasim's method, if I had all of these different organizational methods in my file structure, if I had those in here, that would be a big mess. That would be something that I wouldn't want to mess with. It would get overwhelming and have duplicates of everything. The nice thing about having collections is these images aren't duplicated. So if I have the images that I put on my blog and they're the exact same images that I delivered to my clients, I don't have two copies of these images. Lightroom is a database. It knows that this image, that this particular image here and this particular image here are the exact same image. They all point back to the same source raw file, but they're in two different collections so that I can have all these different ways of organizing my images in a way that makes sense to me. And that's what's most important. This works for me. You might be looking at this and saying, John, you're crazy. This is just ridiculous. Why would you want that much detail? Why do you need all that separation? Don't do it. It doesn't have to work for you, but it works for me. And that's the thing. There's all these capabilities in here, and what works for you is the best way to do it. Now, the important thing here isn't that I use collections and Nasim doesn't, because you can use collections regardless of whether or not you use Lightroom to manage your files. The important thing here is that Nasim uses Lightroom to manage his files and I don't. So Nasim's method, he takes Lightroom, and if he wants to move an image, if he wants to create a folder, if he wants to do anything like that on the file structure, he's using Lightroom to do that. For me, I only use Lightroom to edit images and to have these collections where I can manage my images and reorganize them if I need to without having to worry about my file structure. You saw my file structure. I just have one folder full of raw images. I have all of my different folders for every event, and that's that. I don't care what happens after my images are on my hard drive. Lightroom is purely an editing and an organizing tool for me. So to prove this, if you look over here, I don't even have the folders option in Lightroom. I actually went in here and unchecked it a while back because it just got in my way. I didn't want to see it anymore. I don't use it. I don't reference it. So it was something I just completely took off the screen because it doesn't matter to me. It doesn't work with the way that I use Lightroom. So you might be asking yourself, why don't I use the method that Nasim laid out of hybrid file management, where I actually use Lightroom and its built-in tools, and they're very powerful tools to manage my files themselves? Well, I'm a wedding photographer and I export a lot of images. So any given wedding might be 500, 600, 700 JPEGs that I'm exporting, and they're usually high resolution and low resolution images. Now, going back to my file structure, in each of my different folders, so for any given wedding, so let's say this sample one I made, for the engagement session, I have a JPEG folder, and it has full resolution JPEGs, any that I share online, so Facebook, Instagram, anything like that. If I give them a preview, if I send over a preview file or folder, I used to create sticky albums, and then web resolution images. All those different JPEGs that I export, I put in here and I save them. And the reason for that, and that's just an engagement session. For a wedding, it's the exact same thing, but it's going to be a lot more images. And the reason I do that is exporting 500, 600, 700 full resolution JPEGs takes a lot of time, and it's not something that I want to have to do over and over and over again, or even twice. Once I do it, I want to be done with it. So if I were to use Lightroom to manage all this, and it was pointing to, say, the main parent folder, and it had all the raw files, but it also had all the JPEGs, then it's going to be, Lightroom is going to import, 2, 3, 4, 5 different versions of each image, and that's a pain in the neck. I don't want to deal with that. I don't have to worry about, is this the raw file I'm editing, or is this the low-res JPEG or the high-res JPEG? I don't even want to worry about that. So that's why, for me, I want to manage my files manually. I want to mess with all of my folders manually and just use Lightroom for editing and for its collection capabilities. So to recap, both Nasim and I use a hybrid file management method, but they're very different. His relies a lot more on Lightroom for the file management side, and mine relies, I'm pretty much purely manual for the file management. Neither one is right, neither one is wrong. We do what works the best for us. You should also do what works the best for you. So if you find a different way, or if you want to adopt one of these methods, go for it. Just make sure you use something that works for you. Now, another big thing is, how dependent do you want to be on a program like Lightroom? Nasim, for example, he doesn't use the collections, he doesn't use any of this stuff, and he has no dependency on Lightroom. As he pointed out, he could leave it today, he could lose his entire Lightroom catalog, and he would still be able to operate just fine as far as his edits he's made, as far as his organization goes. He doesn't need Lightroom. Whereas I'm kind of dependent on it. I have all of these collections set up. I have all of these different things, these different ways of organizing my photos, that if I didn't have Lightroom, I'd still be able to find my files. I have all of them organized nicely in my file structure, but I don't have all these collections and all these different things if I don't have Lightroom. But that's not a problem for me. I'm a professional photographer. I'm not planning on stopping using Lightroom anytime soon. So it's up to you to decide how dependent you want to be on a piece of software and modify your workflow and your file management to fit. And lastly, there's JPEG images. Now, earlier I said that I extract everything and I save it all. So I have specific folders for my high res, for low res, for anything I post online. I don't delete those once they're delivered. I save everything that's extracted, and there's a good reason for that. If a client comes to me and says, I lost my wedding disc, I need a replacement, I don't want to have to extract all 700 images again. I just go into my file structure, I open up my JPEG folder, go to high res, copy it to a new disk, deliver it to them. I don't have to re-extract everything because it would take a really long time. And the nice thing is, I don't even have to open Lightroom. All I have to do is open my hard drive. Now, Nasim, on the other hand, he doesn't save JPEGs. He deletes everything once it's delivered, once he has it online. So he wouldn't have that option. If a client came back to him and said, I need a new image or I need a replacement image, he actually has to open up Lightroom, re-extract it, and then he can deliver it. So the difference here mainly comes down to time. For me, it's going to be a lot of my time if I'm going to have to export 700 high-res JPEGs and re-deliver those to a client. I'd much rather just have them in a folder that I can deliver immediately. Whereas Nasim, if he just has to export one, it's not nearly as big of a deal. It's still going to take time, but to him, that's a sacrifice he's willing to make just for simplicity's sake. So to conclude all of this talk about file management and different ways of doing it, there is no right or wrong way. You just need to pick a way that works best for you and stick with it.